Welcome everyone, Costin here with my campaign overview guide for Vilitch the Curseling for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Vilitch is a legendary lord for the Warriors of Chaos, or rather, the Champions of Chaos. He is dedicated to Tzeentch, with all the pros and cons that come with that. Now let's talk a bit about the Warriors of Chaos, just so people understand this. The Warriors of Chaos are one of the most powerful races in the entire game. But how is that? Well, there's a couple of factors that come into play. First off, there is the recruitment. The recruitment is divided between Urban recruitment, which is based on a pool of units in each province. The number of units available, their quality, depends on the level of corruption, depends on the structures that you have within a particular province. Then you also have gifted units, which are basically demonic units that you can get through the Gifts of Chaos, be it undivided gifts or gifts for a particular god. In the case of Vilitch, that would be Tzeentch. So their recruitment can be pretty strong because you can recruit a huge army very, very quickly, provided you have units in your pool, though the gifted units for most legendary lords, with the exception of Be'lakor, are going to be limited to 6 units per army. But it is fairly strong, though it is limited as well in how many units you can recruit per turn. And it certainly favors a playstyle where you keep your units alive. Now the benefit for the Warriors of Chaos, the major benefit, is that a lot of their units are very high in leadership and very high armor. This gives them an advantage not only in terms of manual battles, but also in terms of auto-resolve, because units with high levels of armor and leadership will tend to do better in auto-resolve than units with low armor. Just look at the Skaven, any legendary lord of the Skaven. Even if you win every battle very easily, if you fight it manually, when it comes to auto-resolve, you're gonna be at the disadvantage if you fight as Skaven. As the Warriors of Chaos, that's exactly the opposite. And so you can steamroll the campaign, and after a certain point, you don't even have to fight the battles manually because you can just win them in auto-resolve. Now, this is actually a huge benefit because there are quite a good number of circumstances where you might want to auto-resolve a battle. For instance, say you encounter an army on an open field. You may want to auto-resolve that if you can, because that will prevent the army from retreating, which generally at least some units will actually retreat from the battlefield if you do fight it manually. Whereas auto-resolving it will just completely eliminate the enemy army, unless we're talking about things like the vampire counts or some other very specific races. But for the vast majority of races you auto-resolve, you wipe their armies out. So there's benefits in that. Then there's the Vassal system and Dark Fortress system. The Dark Fortresses are special settlements indicated by this icon. Now, Dark Fortresses are some of the most formidable defensive structures in the entire game. They're the most difficult settlements to take, be it in auto-resolve or from manual battle. They've got good towers, good garrisons, good defensive positions. The AI in general will avoid attacking Dark Fortresses, which is one of the key strengths of the Warriors of Chaos. Well, to be fair, the AI doesn't like to attack heavily fortified settlements because they think they'll lose, rightly so. And this is doubly so for the Dark Fortresses. So you do have a significant defensive advantage. On top of that, each Dark Fortress tends to be tied to a particular vassal. So for instance here, the Red Fortress, which I just took here on turn 1, is tied to this Norscan tribe. So I've just gained them as a vassal. You can also force vassalization on certain other factions as well if you reduce them to their last settlement. Though I believe as Vilitch this won't work to the same extent that it works on as Be'lakor or Archaon, but it is still a fairly effective way. Get more vassals, get income from vassals, have each vassal produce a stack of units. It doesn't matter how good those units are, it's still a full stack of units. And that will prove very, very useful during the course of your campaign. The game plan for any Legendary Lord of the Warriors of Chaos is Try and keep their armies intact. Try and win every battle they fight to them. Upgrade the units for the warband upgrade system. And get as many vassals as possible. And after a point, you just steamroll the rest of the map with ease. Because when you declare war on a faction and you've got 20 vassals backing you up, there's very little that's going to stand in your way. Like, you can just sit back and let your vassals fight endgame crises on their own. That's the Warriors of Chaos as a race, as a faction, if you will. Now let's talk a bit about Vilitch. So Vilitch starts over here near the Red Fortress. There's a minor army of Cathay over here that I just defeated here. And then there's the Red Fortress, which starts controlled by Cathay. After that, you do have several expansion plans. The one I personally would prefer would be to take the Bloodwind Keep, force a vassalization on Lothar over here, who starts with Iron Storm Settlement as well. Force vassalization, then keep heading west. You can avoid having to attack the Great Bastion itself. You can leave your vassals to hold the line, so to speak, against Cathay and counterattacks. So really, you're only going to be dealing with the Imperial Wardens. You can take the Great Bastion, absolutely. But if you just leave your vassals to hold the line, Miao Ying is not going to be an issue early on in a campaign because she's got other threats to deal with. Specifically, this fellow rat right here who's going to swarm her with multiple stacks. Eventually, Cathay will defeat Snitch. Just be aware of that. And they will defeat Lokir Felhart. By that point, they're going to be a problem for you. But you do have some time before they start swarming you with armies. And during that time, you can take 1, 2, 3, 4 Dark Fortresses. Maybe even more than that if you were willing to go all the way to Archeon. But I would probably, I'd certainly take at least these 3 Dark Fortresses in the Red Fortress, Bloodwind Keep, and the Fortress of Eyes. What you do after that is up to you. Do you want to provoke a war against Grimgor? Maybe rush Grimgor, take him out, eliminate a potential threat on you? Or do you want to decide to go against Cathay? Because there's 2 Dark Fortresses near the border here. There's Nangao and there's Wei Jin. Though there's not many Dark Fortresses available in Cathay itself. There's only Shangyang beyond just the 2 next to the Great Bastion, which means that it's not necessarily worth it to expend the huge amount of money and effort to take over all of Cathay. At least not early on in a game. Taking Nangao, taking Wei Jin, that's a different discussion. Taking the entirety of the Great Bastion for yourself, vassalizing whichever faction you can, maybe allying Snitch and Lokir or one of those 2, and leaving them to actually deal with the threat of Xiao Ming, who is certainly going to produce significant armies to fight Snitch, at the very least. I would personally prefer to go over here, take the Challenge Stone, deal with Kolic in one way or another, eliminate Grimgor so he's no longer a threat, or force vassalization maybe on Grimgor one way or another, and then start moving here. If you want to conquer the rest of the map, it is a good idea to capture a substantial number of Dark Fortresses from very early on in a campaign and then worry about the rest of the map. So for much of your early to mid game, you might be dealing with Chaos all across the Northern Chaos Wastes. That's just the campaign plan from a geographic perspective. Now let's talk about Vilitch's benefits as a Legendary Lord and his downsides. He does have access to the teleport stats that Kairos also has access to. In fact, the way I would describe Vilitch is that he has many of the benefits that Kairos has, the powerful magic, the changer of ways, the teleportation, but he lacks the downsides of Kairos. Kairos' army roster is weak, Kairos' economy is non-existent, replenishment is not great. So you get many of the benefits that Kairos has, and none of the downsides. Though there are certainly some downsides for Vilitch in his campaign. But you do get access to all of these, the teleportation stands. Basically, your faction-wide benefits are... you get access to all these good things that Kairos has, for instance. And forces receive benefits from for having high winds of magic, so that can be pretty beneficial for your forces. For Vilitch himself, he steals 15% experience earned by other lords. This isn't a great bonus, though. He does get the passive ability of Twisted Twin. So Twisted Twin is a passive ability that increases spell mastery, melee defense, and melee attack. And the effect increases with time spent in melee or casting spells. So it can be a fairly substantial melee benefit and casting benefit if you're engaged in melee with him. Vilitch is very difficult to kill. He's got a great deal of survivability. He's capable of dealing a great deal of damage. But in terms of other benefits, not necessarily so much. Like a benefit to Forsaken, for instance, or a spawn of Tzeentch, not necessarily too substantial when it comes down to it. Diplomatic benefits, all well and good. Now, one major downside when we're talking about Vilitch is actually with the Gifts of Chaos. The biggest downside. See, you only have free undivided slots and 4 Tzeentch slots. Now, the undivided Gifts of Chaos are generally the best. Dragon Ogre Shagoffs, Hell Cannons, all that. So you should invest in that. The downside for Vilitch, the big issue, is that Tzeentch itself is not really worth investing a lot of points in. See, you get some benefits, but there's always some kind of downside. And outside of the units, which generally are useful to get, when we're thinking about faction-wide benefits, yeah, Tides of Magic can be useful, but that miscast chance can be painful to deal with sometimes. Forbidden Knowledge, it's not worth sacrificing 10 control for 35% research rate. It's a huge amount of control. And while you do have good control as the Warriors of Chaos, and generally won't face rebellions, if you're facing a 10 control penalty, that is going to be a bit of a big issue. I would argue that the only real benefit of Forbidden Knowledge would actually be the defense chance. Like if you're dealing with Skaven, Wood Elves, the like, that do have a high ambush chance, it might be worth getting Forbidden Knowledge, but just for the 35% research rate, I would argue it isn't worth it. Warflame attacks for all units with the Mark of Tzeentch, okay, that's decent enough. Ammunition, you shouldn't play with ranged armies as Warriors of Chaos or as Chaos in general. Your ranged is not really the strongest benefit, with the exception of your artillery, but this is for Tzeentch, for armies led by Tzeentch devoted characters. So technically you can get an ammo benefit for Hell Cannons. Just be aware that Tzeentch devoted characters may struggle with undivided authority. But yeah, having Hell Cannons in your armies is generally a huge benefit. But out of these benefits, there's 3 of them that are okay, like Arcane Wisdom and Arrows of Destiny. One that isn't that great, and one that's a bit iffy, like cooldown and barrier. Yeah, the barrier's nice. The cooldown to spells when you get that massive miscast chance, not worth it from my personal perspective. Now, what's good about Vilitch is that you get a portion of your own battle casualties being converted into souls. Maintaining enough souls can actually be an issue for a lot of campaigns. The fact that you get souls for losing units, even if you may not have significant casualties, can be pretty good. Remember, Warriors of Chaos do have good casualty replenishment. It's very easy for them to recover from battles. Across their empire, there are certainly structures for it. There's other benefits to get when it comes to casualty replenishment. So if you're fighting a campaign where you're out-resolving a lot, naturally you're going to take quite a few casualties there, and you're going to get quite a few souls as a result of it, so you can maintain a lot of gifts. This is more useful when we're thinking about undivided gifts as opposed to the gifts of Tzeentch. I would not run with too many gifts of Tzeentch. I don't think they're that great. 1 or 2 unit types, maybe, but the faction benefits, yeah, they do leave a lot to be desired. And I would argue Vilitch is actually the worst legendary lord of the Warriors of Chaos, though make no mistake on this, he still is a legendary lord of the Warriors of Chaos, so he's still pretty powerful when it comes down to it. And that's all really there is to say about it. I mean, it's a pretty easy to understand campaign, and the playstyle of the Warriors of Chaos is fairly blunt. Get as many vassals as you possibly can. Try and keep your armies alive. Get get units with high leadership and high armor. By the way, speaking about units, let me just touch on the unit roster a bit. What kind of units do you actually want to get with Vilitch? Well, the Chosen of Tzeentch with halberds, not worth it. The Chosen of Tzeentch, the regular ones, pretty good. And of course, the Doom Knights, pretty good as well. And you may, and with Vilitch himself at least, you probably will want a full-on Tzeentch army, with the exception of the artillery. When we're thinking about the undivided side of things, though, I would argue that outside of just having the meat wall that the Chosen of Tzeentch can provide, if you want high damage infantry units, you probably are well suited to go with Chosen with Grey Weapons, which are one of the best infantry units in the entire game, heavy infantry units in the entire game, and eventually going into Aspiring Champions. Your research tree is going to be limited when it comes to that. You're not going to have all the benefits that an undivided warrior of a legendary lord of chaos that's undivided like Archeon or Kolic or Sigvald is going to have. Yours is going to be focused on benefits with Tzeentch. You're not going to have, you're only going to be able to get either undivided units or Tzeentch units. Speaking about that, that also means certain restrictions. Certain restrictions when it comes to your lords, of course, and when it comes to your heroes, because you can only devote yourself to Tzeentch if you're playing as Vilitch. And that's all there is. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and stay tuned for more. I'm also likely going to do Lokir next up, then Nakai, and then possibly Gorst into Greases and Grimgore. We'll see.